Good morning, everybody. In this video, we'll be talking about the iceberg analogy model and the essence of cross-cultural management. Cross-cultural management is a relatively new field of study, and it is based on theories and research from the following disciplines: cross-cultural communication, international management, and psychology of communication. As we see, the key terms here are culture, communication, and management. And today, we're going to focus on culture. What is the best way to define culture? What is culture anyway? According to the concept, which is being commonly used, culture refers to the deposit of knowledge, experience, values, material objects, and possessions valued by a group of people. Culture could also be regarded the following way: as the system of knowledge shared by a relatively large group of people, as the totality of persons' learned, accumulated experience, which is socially transmitted from one generation to another. Culture, in fact, is symbolic communication. Some of its symbols include a group skills, knowledge, beliefs, habits, and values. Culture is not something concrete or tangible, as it can be touched or seen, but we know it exists because people from the same society have roughly the same customs or behavior, basic beliefs and values, and ways of viewing the world. Culture causes this to happen. The person can identify himself or herself with a particular group of people only when he considers himself to be the bearer of their cultural values. For example, a leading Latin American figure you might have heard of, Alejo Carpentier, though born in Lausanne to a French father and a Russian mother, throughout his life considered himself to be a Cuban-born, simply because he felt to be a bearer of the Cuban culture. There are many ways in which culture could be explored. For instance, we could analyze it in terms of components. We can look at the people's behavior, we can analyze the common habits or customs. Or what we could also do is contrast and compare the mainstream and traditional attitudes, values, and beliefs that are shared by different groups of people. Some cultures may promote the ideas of individualism, while the others will be advocating collectivism and interdependence. One of the possible ways to understand and analyze culture and cultural traditions of people who live in different countries is applying models or algorithms that were introduced by numerous scholars. One of the most common models to analyze cross-cultural communication is called the iceberg analogy or the iceberg model. It is true that when we meet somebody who comes from a different culture, the first thing we pay attention at is this person's behavior. Think about the iceberg first of all. Imagine you can see this triangle at the very top. It's the part that it's obvious, we notice it. In our case, it would be person's behavior. Now we have something which is almost hidden beneath the water, and we have the part that we don't see. So we'll be referring to those three parts of an iceberg. Now let's get back to our example. With the behavior, which is obvious, or which could be called the top of an iceberg. It's interesting that looking back at the history of former USSR, it was very easy for the local residents to spot the foreigner, simply because this would be a man or a woman who would speak, of course, a foreign language. He wouldn't speak Russian, and he would use the body gestures and body language in a different way, and this person would be smiling. So, as I've said, people looked at the person, at the way he or she behaved, and in our case, in the case when local residents, those who lived in Moscow or maybe in some other cities, whenever they met a foreigner, they could easily spot this person just because they saw the top of the iceberg. Behavior, gestures, and what was very important, a spot of the body language. This person was, in many of the cases, majority of the cases, this would be a smiling person. And people back in the Soviet Union were not used to it. People rarely smiled in public. So this was one of the very important signals. When we enter another culture, we usually see the tips on the very top of an iceberg. People speak different languages, as I've said, they use different gestures, they eat different food, and they worship in different ways. When a person starts living in another culture, he can actually learn language, he can try some local food, and he can even fall in love with some local ingredients. He can learn how to behave in an appropriate way so that the locals would understand him. And this is something, this part of culture can be easily learned. It's obvious. And that's why it's called the top of an iceberg. Now let's move on. In the middle of an iceberg, we have beliefs. They can be related to political ideas, to some kind of economical notions, to religion as well, and could be sometimes considered contradictory, as people can hold different beliefs. And let's say if a foreigner interferes this section by, for instance, mocking national political system, the locals' reaction might be unpredictable. Because, for example, some people would put it this way: I, myself, can criticize my government. I can make fun of any politician. But I would not tolerate the foreigner doing the same. So I would start criticizing the foreigner. I wouldn't want him to do this. And we are actually moving to the most important and totally hidden part of the culture, which is at the base. It's hidden beneath the water if we look at the iceberg. It is almost entirely learned unconsciously, and its basic components include values, beliefs, ways of thinking, and worldviews. This part is most difficult to understand, analyze, and reflect upon, and this should be taken into consideration. Because it is often assumed that if we meet a person who speaks the same language as we do, who eats the same food the same way as we do, who discusses the same issues we do, and have the same or similar concerns, we automatically start thinking of him as the bearer of our national culture, which is not necessarily true, because what we see is only the top of an iceberg, but we don't realize in this case that there is also a hidden part. Think about immigrants. Think about people who decide to move to another country. What usually happens is that they are gradually being introduced to different aspects of culture, step by step. At the early stage, they see the top of an iceberg. They repeat the way they see people behave. They try to copy some of the behavioral patterns and find it quite easy. Well, because it's not difficult, it's a matter of time. What they do next, they try to adjust in terms of right behavioral patterns, maybe some traditional things. They try to cook some local food, which is also not that difficult. But eventually, they come to understand that they're not capable of accepting the basic values and basic ideas people hold to, because they have nothing in common with those people. That's what they find out at the very end. And that will causes problems, because they realize that it was very easy for them to acquire the top of an iceberg, to understand what is not hidden, to understand this part. But as they moved on and discovered more layers, more dimensions, they finally face this problem. And what happens? Either the person tries to perhaps become more flexible and understand the local values and the ideas that are being shared by the local residents, or those immigrants decide to stick to their own values, worldviews, and beliefs, and they do not try to integrate into the local community. They only stick to those who they already know, which actually causes problems in terms of cross-cultural communication. So what could be derived from this, again, is that when we see that a person speaks the same language we do and eats the same food as we do, this doesn't necessarily mean that he holds to the same system of values and beliefs as we do. And I personally believe that by learning more about the elements of culture and the iceberg analogy in particular, we are actually enabling ourselves to become more flexible and to become more effective in terms of communication across cultures. Thank you very much for your attention.